It is born not of steel and rivets alone, but of a dream of dominance, of luxury so profound it stills the angry motion of the sea itself. The ship is more than a vessel. It is a declaration, a floating palace meant to dwarf all rivals and proclaim the absolute mastery of man over nature. Its name becomes a legend before its keel ever touches water. Titanic, a name that promises strength, grandeur, and an almost divine invincibility. But within its celebrated design, within the very system that conceives and constructs it, a fatal flaw gestates. The arrogance of its creators becomes a part of its architecture, the pursuit of profit a crack in its soul. The magnificent facade of gilded dining rooms and sweeping staircases conceals a cold, mathematical certainty of doom, waiting only for the right conditions to reveal itself. Was it merely an iceberg, a random cruel twist of fate on a calm, dark night? Or was the disaster already written, inscribed in the blueprints, hammered into the hull, and sanctioned in the boardrooms of London and the shipyards of Belfast? How does a machine built to be the zenith of safety, a veritable unsinkable city, become a frozen tomb for over 1,500 souls in less than 3 hours? This is not the story of a singular accident. It is the anatomy of a failure, a systemic collapse where ambition, greed, and willful blindness converge to steer the grandest ship in the world directly into its own legend. What do we owe the dead if not the truth of how they came to lie 2.5 miles beneath the waves? The final tally is a monument to this failure. 1,517 men, women, and children swallowed by the icy Atlantic. The ship, which took 3 years to build, took less than 3 hours to die. The story of its end is not just a tragedy of the sea, it is a forensic investigation into the hubris of an entire era. It is a cautionary tale of a world so entranced by its own technological prowess that it forgot the simple, brutal power of the ocean and the even simpler, more brutal calculus of human error. We must look back, not just at the iceberg, but at every decision that made the collision inevitable. The genesis of the nightmare did not begin in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, but over a quiet dinner in a London mansion in 1907. There, J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, and Lord Peary, chairman of the Belfast shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff, conceived a plan. Their company was losing ground in the relentless transatlantic rivalry. The Cunard Line had just launched 2 ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which were capturing headlines and passengers with their astonishing speed. Ismay knew he could not win a race for the Blue Riband, the prize for the fastest crossing. So he chose a different battlefield. He would build bigger, more luxurious. He would create a class of ship so vast and opulent that speed would become an afterthought. The plan was for a trio of giants, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. They would not be the fastest, but they would be the largest, safest, and most elegant vessels afloat. This decision, born of commercial desperation and personal pride, set the entire tragedy in motion. The core ideology was not safety for its own sake, but safety as a marketing tool, luxury as a weapon, and size as the ultimate statement of corporate power. The lives of future passengers were already secondary to the bottom line in the battle for market share. The seeds of the disaster were sown in this moment of competitive ambition. The chosen location for this grand undertaking was the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. It was a sprawling industrial cathedral, a city unto itself, filled with the clang of hammers and the roar of furnaces. To accommodate the unprecedented scale of the Olympic-class liners, the shipyard itself had to be remade. 3 slipways were merged into 2, and a colossal new structure was erected to straddle them, the Aral Gantry. It was the largest gantry in the world, a towering skeleton of steel that became an icon of industrial might. Inside its looming frame, the Titanic began to take shape, piece by piece. The very environment of its construction was one of overwhelming power and confidence. This was not just a place where ships were built. It was a factory of hubris, where the belief in human ingenuity was forged into every steel plate. Yet it was here, amidst the spectacle of creation, that the first fatal compromises were made. The Titanic was designed with 16 watertight compartments, a revolutionary safety feature. A promotional booklet for the Olympic and Titanic boasted that the ship could stay afloat with any 2 compartments flooded, and even with the first 4 compartments breached, it would remain buoyant. This led to the popular, though unofficial, belief that the ship was practically unsinkable. The flaw was invisible but profound. The watertight bulkheads, the vertical walls separating the compartments, did not extend all the way up to the main deck. They rose only to E-deck in the forward part of the ship. If more than 4 compartments were breached, water would simply spill over the top of the bulkheads from one compartment to the next, like water filling an ice cube tray. It was a design choice made for convenience, allowing for a grander, uninterrupted interior space on the higher decks. It was a trade-off between absolute safety and aesthetic appeal. The most damning decision, however, concerned the lifeboats. The original plans, drawn up by Alexander Carlisle, Harland and Wolff's chief designer, called for 64 lifeboats, more than enough for every soul on board. But this was deemed excessive. A forest of lifeboats would clutter the pristine open space of the first-class promenade deck, spoiling the view and the illusion of a safe, unsinkable ship. J. Bruce Ismay himself is said to have intervened, insisting on a reduction. The final number was set at 20, 16 standard wooden lifeboats and 4 smaller collapsible Engelhard boats. This provided capacity for just 1,178 people, roughly half the number on board during the maiden voyage. But crucially, it was more than the legal minimum required by the hopelessly outdated regulations of the British Board of Trade. The law had not kept pace with technology, and White Star Line used this regulatory failure as cover for a decision that prioritized aesthetics over lives. This was the ultimate enabling condition. The British Board of Trade's rules for lifeboat capacity were based on a ship's gross tonnage and had last been updated in 1894. They capped the requirement at a vessel of 10,000 tons, for which 16 lifeboats were deemed sufficient. The Titanic, at over 46,000 tons, was more than 4 times this size, yet it was legally compliant with just 20 boats. This systemic failure, this lack of governmental oversight, created the permissive environment in which a company could make such a catastrophically irresponsible choice. Society, too, played its part. The public was captivated by the technological sublime, by the sheer size and luxury of these new ocean greyhounds. The promise of progress bred a dangerous complacency. In an era of such magnificent achievement, the idea that such a ship could founder seemed not just unlikely but absurd. The assumption of safety was built into the culture itself. As construction progressed, a pattern of haste and compromise emerged. The Titanic was being built alongside its sister, the Olympic, and the schedule was tight. White Star Line wanted its new flagship in service for the profitable summer season. Later forensic analysis of the wreck and recovered hull pieces would suggest that this rush led to the use of lower quality materials in certain areas. While the central hull was secured with high-grade steel rivets, evidence indicates that number 3 iron rivets, which were cheaper and easier to install but more brittle, were used in the bow and stern sections of the ship. It was precisely in the bow where the iceberg would strike. This was not a deliberate act of sabotage, but the result of a system prioritizing speed and cost efficiency. 1,000 small compromises accumulating into a single fatal weakness. The ship's elder sister, the Olympic, provided a stark warning that went unheeded. In September 1911, the Olympic collided with a Royal Navy cruiser, the HMS Hawke. The Olympic's hull was breached, two of its watertight compartments flooded, and it limped back to Belfast for extensive repairs. While the incident demonstrated the strength of the double-hulled design, it also highlighted the vulnerability of these massive ships to collision damage. Yet the lessons were not fully absorbed. The incident delayed the Titanic's completion, putting even more pressure on the shipyard to make up for lost time. The pattern was clear. The system was designed to push forward, to meet deadlines, to generate revenue, not to pause and reconsider fundamental assumptions about safety. The machinery of evil was not a single entity, but a complex, interlocking system of commercial interests, regulatory failure, and cultural arrogance. In the boardrooms of the White Star Line, men like J. Bruce Ismay made decisions based on profit and loss statements, viewing passenger capacity and ticket sales as the primary metrics of success. In the design offices of Harland and Wolff, brilliant engineers like Thomas Andrews operated within the constraints dictated by their clients, their innovative safety features pared back in the name of economy and aesthetics. The British Board of Trade, the supposed guardian of public safety, acted as a rubber stamp, applying antiquated rules to a new generation of behemoths. And the marketing department spun a myth of invincibility, a narrative that the public eagerly consumed. This was a system where no single person was solely responsible, yet everyone was complicit. The horror was sanitized by bureaucracy, rationalized by profit, and hidden behind a veneer of progress. The psychological landscape was one of profound, almost delusional self-confidence. This was the peak of the Edwardian era, a time of immense technological advancement and imperial certainty. The men who built and ran the Titanic were products of this age. They believed in their own creation with an almost religious fervor. For J. Bruce Ismay, the Titanic was the culmination of his family's legacy, a personal crusade to secure the White Star Line's dominance. For the engineers and officers, there was an understandable pride in their craft, a belief that they had truly conquered the challenges of the sea. This collective psychology created a dangerous blind spot, an inability to seriously entertain the possibility of catastrophic failure. They had built a system so complex and seemingly perfect that they could no longer imagine its collapse. This compartmentalization allowed them to hold two contradictory ideas at once: that they were building the safest ship in the world, while simultaneously cutting corners on the very features that would ensure its survival. Even before the Titanic began its maiden voyage, there were omens, near discoveries where the truth of its vulnerability almost surfaced. As the ship was being loaded with coal in Southampton, a fire broke out in one of its massive coal bunkers, bunker number 6, located right against the bulkhead separating it from the boiler room. For days it smoldered, a hidden inferno in the belly of the ship. The senior officers in Ismay were aware of the fire, but a decision was made to manage it at sea rather than delay the prestigious maiden voyage. The intense, prolonged heat from the fire could have weakened the steel of the bulkhead, the very same bulkhead that would later be gashed open by the iceberg. The voyage began with a secret weakness, a flaw known and concealed. Another warning came just as the ship was leaving the dock at Southampton on April 10, 1912. As the Titanic's powerful propellers churned the water, the massive displacement of water created a suction effect that pulled a nearby smaller steamer, the SS New York, from its moorings. The smaller ship drifted uncontrollably, stern first, directly towards the Titanic's port side. A collision was averted by mere feet, thanks to the quick actions of a tugboat captain. The incident caused a delay of over an hour and was a chilling demonstration of the unforeseen dangers posed by the ship's immense size. It was a chaotic, heart-stopping moment, a near disaster that foreshadowed the greater one to come. But once the danger passed, the incident was dismissed. The great ship proceeded out into the English Channel, its schedule more important than the warnings it had already received. The first few days of the voyage were the system at its zenith, performing with flawless precision. The Titanic was everything it had promised to be. It was a floating city of unparalleled luxury. In first class, the wealthiest industrialists, artists, and aristocrats of the age strolled along the expansive decks, dined in the opulent multi-story restaurant, and relaxed in the Turkish baths and swimming pool. The ship's engines ran smoothly, the service was impeccable, and the vessel cut through the calm seas with a steady, reassuring grace. This was the public face of the enterprise, the validation of every decision made in the boardroom and the shipyard. For the passengers and most of the crew, the ship felt as solid as the land they had left behind. The myth of unsinkability was now a tangible reality. But beneath the gilded decks in the cramped and Spartan quarters of steerage were the invisible victims of this system. Over 700 third-class passengers, mostly immigrants from across Europe, were packed into the lower decks of the ship. They were the human cargo of the transatlantic trade, families like the Goodwins, an English couple with their 6 children, chasing the promise of a new life in America. They had no access to the grand public rooms or the open boat decks. Their world was confined to the noisy, vibrating lower levels of the hull, close to the engines. In the cold calculus of the era, their lives were deemed less valuable. They had paid the least for their passage, and in the coming disaster, they would pay the ultimate price. The ship's very geography was a map of social hierarchy, a hierarchy that would prove fatal when the evacuation began. On Sunday, April 14th, the system of communication, which should have been the ship's shield, became another point of failure. Throughout the day, the Titanic's wireless room received a series of increasingly urgent ice warnings from other ships in the North Atlantic. The sea ahead was a minefield of icebergs, but the 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were not employees of the White Star Line. They worked for the Marconi Company, and their primary duty was to transmit and receive private telegrams for the wealthy first-class passengers, a lucrative source of revenue. The stream of passenger messages was relentless. When a critical warning came in that evening from a nearby ship, the SS Californian, reporting that it was stopped and surrounded by ice, a frustrated Jack Phillips cut off the transmission. He was buried in a backlog of commercial traffic. The message was not passed to the bridge. The system prioritized profit over safety, chatter over warnings, right until the very end. The external pressure that finally broke the system was simple, ancient, and utterly indifferent. It was a massive iceberg, calved from a Greenland glacier that had drifted south into the shipping lanes. The night of April 14th was unusually calm and clear but moonless. The sea was as flat as glass, which meant there were no waves breaking at the base of the berg to make it visible. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, perched in the crow's nest, were scanning the dark horizon with only their own eyes. The ship's binoculars inexplicably had been misplaced and were locked in a cabinet for which no one had the key. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw it, a shape darker than the darkness ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge, shouting the fateful words, "Iceberg, right ahead." The collision was deceptively gentle. For many passengers, it was a slight shudder, a subtle grinding noise that barely disturbed their sleep. But on the bridge and deep within the ship's hull, the reality was immediate and horrifying. First Officer William Murdoch had ordered the ship hard a starboard and the engines reversed. But the vessel was too large and moving too fast to turn in time. Instead of a head-on impact, which the ship might have survived, the iceberg scraped along the starboard side, popping rivets and opening up a series of gashes below the waterline. The internal pressure of the system had met the unyielding external reality of the ice. Deep in the bowels of the ship, seawater began to pour in. The breakthrough, the moment the myth shattered, came in a quiet, grim meeting. Captain Edward Smith summoned the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who had been on board for the maiden voyage, to assess the damage. With his blueprints in hand, Andrews toured the forward section of the ship and quickly returned with a death sentence. The iceberg had breached not 2, not 4, but at least 5 and likely 6 of the forward watertight compartments. Water was pouring in and spilling over the top of the bulkheads into the compartments behind. It was a simple, brutal matter of physics. Andrews gave the ship a maximum of 2 hours before its bow would dip low, enough for the sea to flood the upper decks and pull the entire vessel down. The unsinkable ship was going to sink. The flaw designed and built into its very structure was now claiming its due. It was a mathematical certainty. The revelation of the ship's fate triggered the collapse. The carefully constructed order of the floating city dissolved into a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival. The order was given to uncover the lifeboats and muster the passengers on deck. But years of complacency and the deeply ingrained belief in the ship's invincibility had left the crew ill-prepared for a real emergency. There had been no proper lifeboat drill. The evacuation was poorly coordinated, marked by confusion and contradictory orders. The policy of women and children first was interpreted differently on opposite sides of the ship. On one side, men were prevented from boarding even empty seats, while on the other, they were allowed to board if no women were present. The most tragic failure was the launching of the lifeboats themselves. Terrified of the boats buckling under a full load, or unwilling to wait for more people to arrive, crew members launched many of them drastically underfilled. The first boat to leave, Lifeboat 7, had a capacity for 65 people but was lowered with only 28 on board. Lifeboat 1, a small emergency cutter with a capacity for 40, left with just 12. In the frantic and disorganized evacuation, hundreds of seats went empty. Seats that could have saved lives. As the ship's bows sank lower and its stern rose high into the air, the angle of the deck became impossibly steep. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the scene into terrifying darkness, broken only by the stars and the rockets being fired futilely into the night sky. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, with a deafening roar of groaning metal and collapsing machinery, the Titanic broke apart and slipped beneath the waves, leaving more than 1,500 people struggling for their lives in the freezing 28-degree water. The accounting began in the dark. The rescue ship, the RMS Carpathia, had heard the Titanic's distress calls and had raced through the same ice field at a dangerously high speed to reach the scene. It arrived 2 hours after the sinking to a horrifying sight, a handful of lifeboats scattered across a calm sea and the faint dying cries of hundreds. The crew of the Carpathia worked for hours, pulling 705 survivors from the lifeboats. They found a field of bodies, frozen solid, bobbing in their life jackets. The scale of the loss became clear as the sun rose. The forensic accounting was brutal. Only a third of those on board had survived. The class divide, so stark in life, was even starker in death. Over 60% of first-class passengers survived, compared to just 24% of those in third class. The locked gates and confusing passageways of steerage had become a death trap. In the weeks that followed, 2 major inquiries were held, one by the United States Senate and another by the British Board of Trade. They sought to understand the disaster and assign blame. J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman who had survived by stepping into one of the last lifeboats, was savaged by the American press and branded a coward. He became the public face of the disaster, a convenient scapegoat. Captain Stanley Lord of the SS Californian, the ship that had been closest to the Titanic and had seen its distress rockets but failed to respond, was officially condemned for his inaction. but the system that had truly caused the disaster largely escaped indictment. The inquiries documented the insufficient lifeboats, the ignored ice warnings, and the excessive speed, but they stopped short of holding the White Star Line's management or the Board of Trade legally culpable for the deaths. The survivors and the families of the victims were left to grapple with the aftermath. For those who were pulled from the water, the physical and psychological trauma was lifelong. Many lost their entire families. The fight for financial compensation was long and arduous, ultimately limited by maritime laws that capped the liability of the shipping line. Memorials were erected and advocacy groups were formed, but for thousands of people, the sinking of the Titanic was a wound that would never fully heal, a ghost that would haunt their families for generations. The official inquiries, while providing a detailed record of the event, also functioned as a form of institutional cover-up. The British inquiry in particular was led by Lord Mersey, a man with deep ties to the shipping industry. Its conclusion was widely seen as a whitewash, designed to protect the reputation of the White Star Line, Harland and Wolff, and the British Board of Trade. While acknowledging errors, the final report ultimately framed the sinking as a unique event, an act of God, rather than the predictable outcome of systemic negligence. The focus on the failures of individuals like Captain Lord conveniently drew attention away from the corporate and regulatory decisions that had made the tragedy almost inevitable. Justice for the 1,500 dead was sacrificed for the stability of the industry. Despite the failures of the inquiries, the Titanic disaster entered public consciousness as a powerful and enduring myth. It became a timeless parable about the dangers of technological hubris, the stark realities of social class, and the eternal conflict between humanity and the forces of nature. The story was told and retold in books, poems, songs, and later in blockbuster films. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 by Robert Ballard opened a new chapter, transforming the ship from a myth into a tangible archaeological site. Forensic analysis of the wreck provided new evidence, confirming theories about the low-grade rivets and the nature of the damage, adding a final scientific postscript to the tragic tale. The sinking was a brutal lesson, but it was a lesson learned. In the immediate aftermath, the disaster prompted sweeping and permanent changes to maritime safety regulations. The first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was convened in 1914, establishing new rules that mandated lifeboat capacity for every single person on board a vessel, required 24-hour radio watches, and standardized emergency procedures. The International Ice Patrol was created to monitor the North Atlantic, tracking icebergs and warning ships of danger. In a very real sense, every passenger who has traveled by sea since 1914 owes their safety in part to the sacrifice of those who died on the Titanic. The system, shocked into action by an unprecedented catastrophe, was finally forced to reform. The story of the Titanic is more than a historical event. It is a permanent warning. It reminds us that catastrophic failure is rarely the result of a single error, but of a chain of them, of a system that prioritizes profit over people, convenience over caution, and arrogance over humility. We are left with an unsettling question. What are the modern Titanics we are building and sailing on today? What systemic flaws in our own complex world, in our financial systems, our energy policies, our technological ambitions, are we willfully ignoring? The 1,517 souls lost in the Atlantic do not ask for our pity. They ask for our vigilance. They ask us to remember that the greatest and most confident of human creations are only ever as strong as the integrity of the system that builds them. They ask us to watch for the icebergs ahead,